Short of this is that Crackle essentially. What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you the things at DC, because it kind of fed into Wally West's love. It's really kind of interesting. It's basically a being made out of radio waves, and it's a being simply called Crackle. But the funny thing about this is that what it does is it essentially says, back when Wally was a kid, before he got his powers, he had a radio that he would talk into, and he would get a response from that radio. And basically the person on the other end, who he believed to be fictional, would basically tell him about like Radio Land, this place where there's like, radio waves and things that are made of radio waves and all kinds of cool stuff, because it kind of fed into Wally West's love of like the radio industry and how radios worked and different things like that. The long and short of this is that Crackle essentially explains that it's raced against 6 different opponents and it's won every time. I'm sorry, Quiz rather. His raced against 6 different opponents and won every time. And so the question becomes, how in the world can Wally West win facing off against an opponent that's defeated 6 other people? And so this is when we find out the nature of the race. It's not like, some race where they just kind of run across from like Earth to Mars or something like that. They're running throughout the entire, space-time continuum. They're effectively running across the universe, and they're transitioning into all these different planes and different things like that. But it's insane because when this race kicks off, what ends up happening is the first challenge, quote unquote, they have to face is basically a black hole. And this is a pretty big deal because when it comes to black holes, one of the things that DC kind of keeps intact is the physical properties of a black hole in the real world, in the sense that the gravitational pull is so extreme that light can't escape. I mean, at the end of the day, a black hole is just a collapsed dead star. The long and short of this is that when it comes to the Flash, there's basically, I guess the speed of light is kind of like the upper limit. I mean, a Flash can travel faster than the speed of light, but when they do, they risk entering the Speed Force. And that's the concern that Wally West has. Because light cannot escape a black hole, if he runs at a speed that basically exceeds the speed of light in order to get past, in order to basically make his way, around this black hole, then what it means is that he could potentially enter the Speed Force. Now remember, the way that this is done by Grant Morrison, and even the way it was kind of done by Mark Waid, is a speedster can't really choose to enter the Speed Force. I mean, they kind of can, but in the instance, if they're kind of brushing up against it, like you running alongside a brick wall, the Speed Force will grab them and drag them in, even if they don't want to be there. And that's exactly what happens to Wally. As he's running, he's basically approaching this massive amount of energy, basically the source of where he draws his speed from, and it immediately starts to pull him in. And so where it seems as though he's basically lost to the Speed Force, what ends up happening is we basically have like Quiz that reaches in and grabs him because he's made of radio waves. Now, in truth and historically speaking, this shouldn't be the case. A person who's not a speedster can't just enter into the Speed Force, meaning a person who doesn't draw their energy from the Speed Force can't necessarily enter the Speed Force. The Speed Force is like a giant door, and the only people who have the key to that door are speedsters. And so technically speaking, as far as I'm aware, Quiz shouldn't be able to just like reach into the Speed Force and grab Wally. But because of the fact that he does, he ultimately ends up saving him, yanking him out, and they end up in like the distant past, eons and eons, billions of years into the past, in the early days of the Maltusians. Now, of course, we know the Maltusians basically go on to become the guardians of the universe. But because of the fact that the Maltusians are effectively the first sentient beings in the universe, what this meant is that we are talking about, probably around 7 or 8 billion years in the past. And that's the nature of things. Keep in mind, when it comes to like, the space-time continuum, they're not separate. Space is not separate from time. For example, you have the idea, I think it's, special theory of relativity. The speed of an object is relative to the speed of light. And then general theory of relativity, the speed of object is relative to the speed of light and the impact of everything around it. That, space, when it comes to like, Earth, for example, if I were to take a giant piece of paper towel and I were to sit the Earth on it, or sit like a giant golf ball on it or something like that, it would cause an indentation in that paper towel. That's how, planets and stars impact space. It's more of a fabric than an actual like finite structure. And so because of that, when an object has enough force, it can pull in things around, or enough gravity, they can pull in objects around it, different things like that. And that's the nature of this whole thing. That's the nature of this whole scenario. It's kind of, running back and forth through time, the fact that you can't, travel through time without traveling through space, different things like that. It gets kind of weird and it gets kind of, metaphysically. But the fact remains here that what ends up happening is that with this spanning over the course of about 4 or 5 days, that basically is kind of Grant Morrison skipping over things, in the sense that you end up having like Quiz and you end up having Wally West who continue their race. They kind of race closer to the modern day. Quiz ends up outracing Wally West, gets way ahead, different things like that. But it is kind of wild and it is kind of intriguing because there's one point where it's day 8 and Wally West is running continually to the present day from the distant past. and he actually ends up coming, or at least running through Krypton at the point where it's exploding, which is about 30 years before the modern day. Now, I do want to talk about this for a second. When it comes to DC Comics, for years and years and years, there was no real timeline given in terms of when things happened. It was just somewhere along the line, Krypton exploded, somewhere along the line, Superman landed on Earth, somewhere along the line, Bruce Wayne became Batman. That was really it. There was never really like a chronological order of things in terms of DC saying, here's when it all happened. All this changed in 1993 with 0 Hour Crisis in Time. And what DC did is they basically completed that massive event and then gave us a timeline. They said, like, 10 years ago, Superman arrived on Earth. 10 years ago, Bruce Wayne became Batman. And so that's why we get this 30-year window. That's what was established in 0 Hour Crisis in Time. 30 years ago, Krypton blew up. And so it is kind of interesting in terms of like how it ties into the greater DC landscape. But the fact remains that with Wally kind of racing as fast as he can, this is when we find out kind of like the darker side of the race. The way this is done is that if you win, let's say for example that Wally West wins this race, what it would mean is that the planet of Quiz would be totally obliterated, and then Wally would have to race again. And he would have to keep on racing until he lost. And when he lost, Earth would be destroyed, and the new winner would be forced to race and continue to race until they fail, and then their planet is destroyed and a new winner is chosen. And so that's how this whole thing works, that Wally's kind of facing this almost no-win situation in the sense that there's no real conceivable way for him to be able to succeed. Ultimately, he and Earth are going to be destroyed in this great race that goes on. And so what we end up having is Wally finally catching up to Quiz on this kind of a pit stop that has been set up in different locations around the cosmos. And what ends up happening here is Quiz basically says the reason he was able to defeat the 6 other opponents was not purely based on his speed alone. But what we end up finding out is that the energy of a person's home planet, which is to say the kinetic energy put off by the citizens of a home planet running, can basically be siphoned off by Wally West and then used to bolster his own speed. And so this is cool. This is when it gets into the meta commentary of Grant Morrison, because what Grant Morrison basically says is, sure, the Earth has all kinds of problems, but at the end of the day, everybody wants to live. And so because of that, when Wally West just kind of uses the intercom that's been attached to him that allows him to continually communicate with Earth instantaneously, what this means is that it allows him to effectively tell everybody on Earth, everyone has to run. Every single human being out there, every person, regardless of where you come from, regardless of how old you are, if you can run, you have to run, because I can siphon off your energy and I can ensure the survival of our species by basically winning the race and beating Quiz. Now this is kind of cool because the other half of this is that Wally has a genius idea. Wally sits down with these guys and says, okay, so you guys bet. The whole basis of this is that you guys do this to gamble. And so the response of Wally is, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna start a new bet. I will race you all the way back to Earth. And if I get there before you do, you have to spare my planet. And it's kind of cool because what this means is that Wally West is going to travel so astronomically fast, millions of miles, in less than an instant. And that's one thing I want you guys to keep in mind here. And this next little bit that we go over, all this happens in the fractions of a second. You can't even measure it. Snap your fingers right now. And this race happens in less time than that. It's insane. The issue with this is that Wally can't necessarily do it on his own because of the fact, with everybody out there racing, with everybody running, it's still not necessarily fast or enough energy for him to basically siphon it off and make it back to Earth. So what ends up happening is Quiz actually throws his power to Wally West and sacrifices his life in the process. But what it does is it doubles the speed of Wally West. In response to this, what also ends up happening is Superman, Jay Garrick, Impulse, Max Mercury, these various speedsters who are out there also run as fast as they can, bolstering the power of Wally even more. And so in truth, it's not really just Wally's speed on its own that allows him to achieve this insane amount of distance in such a short amount of time. It's really him kind of feeding on the speed of everybody else around him. But remember, this works because one of the big changes that was made to the character of Wally West, one of the big things that was established with him is that unlike other speedsters, he can both gift his speed to other people and take his speed away. Now, other people have been given that power over the years, but Wally was the first one to do it. And so with Wally being able to, siphon off the speed of others or gift others a fraction of his own speed, he basically draws on all this energy that's being sent directly into him and not only makes it back to Earth before one of these, gambling guys does, he makes it back to Earth and actually manages to make his way around Jay Garrick and Superman about 1,000,000 times before they get here. And so it's insane because what ends up happening is we end up also finding out that with Wally West making this race, what he also did is he grabbed the citizens of Quiz's people and brought them to Earth. And so effectively the planet's going to be destroyed, but the planet's completely uninhabited. It doesn't matter. And so the Earth of Wally West has been totally saved. Not only that, he's basically saved this race of people, and then of course gives them a chance to basically find their own world, find a place they can go off to or just reside on Earth or something along those lines. But it's pretty wild and it's pretty insane because it's a crazy amount of speed. So effectively Wally Wally's kind of hailed as like this savior of the savior of Earth, more or less. That he's the being who essentially saved everybody in existence. And so the way that this kind of works when it comes to Grant Morrison's stories, what would it be without like a plot twist or something along those lines? What ends up happening is Wally, basically speaking to a class and talking about the nature of what it means to try to save the world and how you always have to kind of persevere and keep on going. He takes a picture with the class. Though when the picture's finished and the people look at it, what we end up finding out is in the background of this picture is the Black Flash watching Wally West. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, the events of Dark Knight Metal basically confirm Final Crisis and tell us that Final Crisis is in the existence of DC's continuity as it stands right now. The reason why I make that declaration and make that statement is because the New 52 erased a lot of things from before 2011. A lot of things that happened in DC Comics before 2011 were eliminated in their entirety. But in order to make Dark Knight's Metal make more sense, we're going to cover Final Crisis. Now, here's the deal. Final Crisis is crazy. It is it's absolutely bonkers, because this is one of those stories where it's just like Grant Morrison just being crazy. That's really what it is. It's Grant Morrison just being insane. For those of you guys who don't know, writer Grant Morrison has this tendency to take these metaphysical concepts, these things like how we perceive good and evil, and then apply characters to them and say, this is the world, this is how it works. Kind of a weird scenario. But fortunately for us, things are not that extreme when it comes to like the Final Crisis story. They're just weird. Is really all it is. Now, what this initially does is it picks up with a guy by the name of Dan Turbin. And Dan Turbin has been around in DC Comics for quite some time. I want to say he appeared in Detective Comics number 64 in 1941, maybe it was 1942. And I believe he was adjusted, like he was actually given form, given a character in the New Gods solo series by Jack Kirby. And we'll talk more about the New Gods here in like 5 seconds. But the whole basis behind this New Gods thing is that this initially deals with the arrival of a guy named Orion. Now, Orion just kind of crash lands on Earth, but this is the first indication that a massive set of events are happening. And the reason for this is because Dan Turbin is just a detective. He's just a guy who just goes and looks at cases, different things like that. But when it comes to DC Comics, the New Gods were kind of a weird situation. When Jack Kirby originally launched the whole New Gods Fourth World epic back in the 1970s, when he left Marvel Comics, the idea was to create this wholly separate imprint away from DC's superhero landscape, and it would just be out there by itself in the middle of no man's land. So you would basically have DC superheroes, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, so on and so forth, and then isolated from that and never crossing over, you would have the Fourth World epic, which is where you would get Darkseid and things along those lines. The problem with this was that Jack Kirby left before he completed the project. The rumor is that DC treated him like crap, so he ended up leaving and going back to Marvel again. And because of this, he never finished the Fourth World epic. And so what DC did is they grabbed all these concepts of the New Gods and then rolled them over into their main DC continuity. But in the realm of the pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths landscape, because of the fact that the Fourth World was supposed to be removed from the DC continuity, while it was rolled in, it was basically established as a separate universe, because in 1961, DC made the multiverse with Flash of Two Worlds. And so because of this, with Crisis on Infinite Earths coming along and saying, okay, there is no multiverse anymore, there's only one universe, DC had to find a way to work the New Gods in as a group that was originally part of a different universe, but is now part of the main universe with all the other superheroes. And so what they did is they went through, and I believe it was in the Cosmic Odyssey series by Jim Starlin, they went through and they basically came back and said, okay, you have Apocalypse and you have New Genesis. Apocalypse is where Darkseid hangs out at, New Genesis is where his mortal enemy Highfather hangs out at, and it was all part of the universe. They were just out there in some galaxy somewhere. But eventually events took place in such a form that things like the anti-life entity, the anti-life equation, stuff like that started popping up, and it basically just walled off their galaxy. And so in effect, they were isolated isolated, an alternate universe insofar as their galaxy wasn't able to access anything else. And DC used this as kind of a bootstrapped way to say, this is how it is they're coming into the superhero universe, but it's the reason why superheroes can't really go to them. But the fact that Orion has basically died, or at least is believed to have died, is a pretty big deal, because new gods are beings with incredible amounts of power. And for a new god to basically just be eliminated in their entirety is something that immediately strikes a chord with anybody. It would be like if Superman just crashed on a dock somewhere and then was dead. Nobody would know why. People would be like, what in the heck happened? What in the world took place here? And so the result is that it's this huge investigation. Now, remember, because of the fact that the new gods are massive in scale, one of the big things that DC did is they came back and they launched a story called Infinite Crisis. Now, when it comes to the different crises DC's done over the course of their landscape, they're pretty straightforward. DC made the multiverse in 1961 with Flash of Two Worlds. They got rid of the multiverse with Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985. They brought the multiverse back in 2006 with Infinite Crisis, and this story, Final Crisis, makes the superheroes aware of it. But as it stands right now, post Infinite Crisis, the new gods do have their own reality. They have their own universe, that kind of a thing. But the idea is that, again, with one of them being killed, this is huge news, and it actually draws the attention of everyone because everybody's aware of who the new gods are. Specifically, it draws the attention of the Green Lanterns, John Stewart, Hal Jordan, so on and so forth, but it also draws the attention of someone named Renee Montoya. Now, Renee Montoya was originally a character who was introduced in Batman the Animated Series, and she was rolled over in Detective Comics 475 in 1992. But the idea here is that Renee Montoya is like Harley Quinn. Harley Quinn basically showed up in Batman the Animated Series, and because the show was so popular, DC and Warner Brothers began grabbing characters that didn't exist in comics and then started rolling them over into the comics. Now, Renee Montoya was just a detective. I mean, of course, she was gay and she had a girlfriend, different things like that, but her girlfriend was killed. And what this did is it coincided with her basically taking over the mantle of the Question. I'm throwing a ton of stuff at you guys. I'm throwing a lot of history at you guys because there's so much that goes into this. So the Question was a guy named Victor Sage, and he was basically created for Charlton Comics. Charlton Comics sucks. They were just one of those comic book publishers that exist out there. They went belly up in 1967, and so the Question was rolled over into DC's landscape. The Question, Victor Sage, he was like Rorschach from The Watchmen, right? Like, he was just a guy who showed up, he wore this mask that hid his face, and he just beat the crap out of criminals at night. That's really what he was. He was almost like Batman in a lot of those ways. The idea was that Victor Sage ended up dying, and his student at the time, for the most part, Renee Montoya, took over the mantle. And this is because of the fact that Renee Montoya's girlfriend had died and she had become an alcoholic. But it was a way for DC to take a character who was originally popular in Batman the Animated Series, but had long since lost her popularity, and basically rework her in a way that fans would actually care about her. So she doesn't play a significant role, but I figured I'd drop that little tidbit of knowledge here for you guys. I mean, she basically tells Dan Turbin, hey, the questions that you're asking for with all these kids who are vanishing is in a place called the Dark Side Club. Now, of course, this also coincides with, Hal Jordan talking with John Stewart about the idea that Orion has been killed. The problem with this was that when John Stewart originally tried to get a hold of Hal Jordan after the, 10/11 came in, basically the warning to the Green Lanterns that a god had been killed and somebody needed to investigate, John Stewart was not able to get a hold of Hal Jordan. And that's a very important thing. But what we end up doing is jumping to a group called the Secret Society of Supervillains. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's just supervillains. All hanging out, scheming, trying to find ways to defeat heroes, different things like that. But one of these characters crops up as a guy named Libra. Now, Libra's had virtually no important aspects in DC Comics at all. This guy I think he appeared in like some Justice League story, like 111 through 114 or something like that. And that was it. The fact that Libra is here is interesting because we initially don't know why. All we know is that Libra basically makes the case, hey, I am going to give you guys your heart's desires. I'm going to basically give you guys everything you want to prove that you guys should hand over control of the Secret Society of Supervillains to me. And then in turn, I can lead us down the path of destroying all the heroes who were out there. Now, in truth, the Secret Society is really just kind of like, whatever. And there's no reason for them to believe this, because for a guy like Libra to suddenly pop up out of nowhere, who's basically had no meaningful escapades whatsoever, and say, I'm the answer to all your problems, is nonsense. It's like if you're walking down the road one day and some guy walks up to you and says, hey, I can make all your wildest dreams come true. If you're a fool, you'll follow him. But if you have any measure of common sense, you'll be like, get out of here. That's ridiculous. But in order to prove that he can actually do what it is that he says he can do, he ends up killing Martian Manhunter. Now, this is where the death of Martian Manhunter comes from. For those of you guys who are following our Green Lantern videos on Sundays, and we picked it with Blackest Night, where Martian Manhunter comes back as a Black Lantern. He basically comes back from the dead. But in this this instance, there was a prison that was created for supervillains. And the idea was that Martian Manhunter had basically infiltrated the prison to really just kind of keep an eye on things and report back to the Justice League. But Libra had known about this. Of course, this was also because of the fact that Catwoman had figured things out and basically told Libra what was going on. But in response, when Martian Manhunter was attacked by the prisoners inside the prison itself and then quote unquote whisked away by Libra, he's effectively killed. Because remember, at this point in time, Martian Manhunter has a literal weakness to fire. And so the result of this is that Martian Manhunter is dead, and it proves to the various members of the secret society of supervillains that they can actually pull this off. Now, what this does is this follows up with Turpin, and it officially jumps into the introduction of Darkseid. What this does is it picks up with a guy who's just referred to as Boss Darkseid, and the idea that these various kids have basically been brought under Darkseid's control. Now, we're not initially told how it was that this had happened. Instead, we just knew these kids were being controlled by Boss Darkseid, and that was really about it. In truth, this is due to the fact that these kids are under the influence of the anti-life equation. Now, we'll talk more about the anti-life equation in the next video. The long and short of it for right now is that the anti-life equation is basically just this equation that if a person cracks it, if they figure it out, they can dominate the wills of others. They can basically bend others to their control with an almost absolute control. But that's basically what we're being told here, that Darkseid has managed to figure out a way to crack the anti-life equation. The other half of this, and a story that was covered, or I guess events that were covered in DC Universe number 0, is that there was a war among the New Gods, and that Darkseid had quote-unquote died. In truth, his spiritual essence had just been thrown into the body of a normal person. So it's very similar to the idea of like Ragnarok from Marvel Comics. Thor dies, all the Asgardians die, and they're reborn in human bodies, and Thor has to run around and wake them up, bring about their true selves. And the difference here is that these guys who have been reborn on Earth in human bodies, when their spiritual essences were teleported to that location, they know who they are. They're simply just biding their time and trying to find a way to conquer the Earth. And so what we end up doing here is picking up with the Justice League following the death of Orion and the investigation into how it happened. Now, what this does is it brings into sharp relief something called the Alpha Lanterns. There was a story that basically dealt with the idea of the Sinestro Corps, the Yellow Lanterns created by Thal Sinestro, going to war against the Green Lanterns in the Sinestro Corps War. But there was an instance where a member of the Sinestro Corps who had basically surrendered was killed by a Green Lantern. Because of this, not only was the Green Lantern kicked out of the Green Lantern Corps, but the Guardians of the Universe, the ones responsible for creating the Green Lanterns, had basically said, we can no longer allow you guys to run unchecked. Instead, we're going to create something called the Alpha Lanterns. And the Alpha Lanterns are going to serve the purpose of basically policing the police. Now, the Alpha Lanterns answer directly to the Guardians of the Universe themselves, and they're effectively cyborgs, but they're the ones that carry out these internal investigations. But regardless, they're the ones conducting this and trying to figure out what's going on, because in the middle of all this, John Stewart's basically attacked by someone that he doesn't initially consider to be an enemy, only for the Alpha Lanterns to arrest Hal Jordan. And the implication here is that Hal Jordan is the one who not only killed Orion, but it also attacked John Stewart. And that brings into the equation the idea that superheroes like Hal Jordan are being dominated by the anti-life equation. Now, switching back over to Batman, essentially what happens is with him having his detective skills and basically being able to piece things together and figure out what's going on, because of the fact that these Alpha Lanterns are part sentient, because they still have a conscious mind of their own, albeit half machine, they can still be controlled through means that are insanely powerful. And the anti-life equation has no limit. And so because of this, the implication is that one of these members of the Alpha Lanterns had basically had their will dominated by the anti-life equation. And the result is that either they tampered with the crime scene or something along those lines. Batman seems to figure out what's going on. He's basically snatched up by a boom tube and whisked away to Apocalypse. Again, it's essentially this idea that the superheroes are slowly being removed one by one. Now, what this does is this brings into the equation the idea of the Justice Society of America. Now, the best way to think about the JSA is that they are basically the 1940s superheroes from DC Comics. The Flash, Jay Garrick, the Green Lantern, Alan Scott, so on and so forth. The kicker is this. In 1956, because Barry Allen was introduced as the new Flash, there was no explanation as to where it was Jay Garrick had gone to. And so what DC did is they came along in 1961 and they said, well, see, what had happened was when we started publishing stories about the Flash Barry Allen, we actually switched over to stories from a new universe. We just didn't tell you. And so what they said was that every story that ever featured the Flash Barry Allen on the Justice League, or whatever the case may be, that was all in Earth 1. All the stories that featured like the Flash, Jay Garrick, things like that were Earth 2. The problem problem with this was that, again, when Crisis on Infinite Earths happened, DC had to find a way to basically either justify the existence of the JSA, kind of reconciling the idea of an alternate universe, or if there were no alternate universes, kill them off entirely. And that's what they did. After Crisis on Infinite Earths, the JSA was gone. They basically just vanished from the face of the earth. Now, this lasted until 1991 with Roy Thomas, I think it was, and it was basically this story that was done in Secret Origins issue number 31, which is technically volume 2, but the idea was that DC came along and said, okay, so any of these old school superheroes that basically have modern day counterparts, a 1940s Wonder Woman, like a JSA Earth 2 Wonder Woman, a JSA Earth 2 Superman, things like that, they're gone. And what they did is they came back and they said, okay, so in this new universe continuity after Crisis on Infinite Earths, the JSA were actually just superheroes who fought in the 1940s and 1950s, and they've long since retired and the new superheroes took up the mantle. Now, that did not answer the question as to why it was the JSA was never referenced in the origin stories of superheroes as they appeared in the mid-1980s after Crisis on Infinite Earths happened. But most fans just kind of took it. They just kind of said, whatever, we just want to see the JSA come back. This lasted until 1993 and 2006 respectively. 2006 was probably the most important date just because of the fact that with Infinite Crisis seeing the return of the multiverse, it allowed DC to basically bring back Earth 2 and to say, here's the newer origin of the JSA in DC's comics. It also allowed a lot of crossing over, different things like that, but Infinite Crisis was largely launched because DC's continuity had managed to just go to absolute pieces within the 20 years of Crisis on Infinite Earths running to Infinite Crisis. But the overall gist of this is that characters like the Flash Wally West, who's the Flash after Crisis on Infinite Earths due to Barry Allen being killed, and the original Flash Jay Garrick, they were able to cross over, they were able to meet, and it actually resulted in some pretty cool stories. But in this instance, Wally and Jay Garrick are just kind of going through and, investigating things at the request of Batman, and that's really about it. Any information they can find about the death of Orion, anybody who saw anything, they're basically investigating that. But in the middle of this investigation, they're suddenly met with this insanely blinding flashing light, only for us to see the return of Barry Allen. Now, this is huge. This was a massive moment in the realm of DC, because remember, when it came to everything from Infinite Crisis running all the way up to 2011 with Flashpoint and the New 52, the goal was to basically set the stage. But regardless of how they look at it, ultimately it's this idea that when it comes to Barry Allen, he had been believed to have been dead since Crisis on Infinite Earths. We covered that story already. You'll find that story down in the description. When Barry Allen sacrificed his life, it allowed DC to remove his character from the landscape and put Wally West in his place. And we got some really cool stories. And in fact, we saw a lot of the limits being pushed when it came to the Flash Wally West, the kind of abilities they had, different things like that. A lot of that was pushed to the extreme with Wally West. It's one of the reasons why a lot of fans loved his character, because things like the Speed Force were created during the run of Wally West. There's just all these crazy things that happened during those stories. But the return of Barry Allen is a big deal, because what this does is it sets the stage for the interim Flash stories between this story, Final Crisis, and the start of New 52. It deals with things like the Flash Rebirth, Barry Allen's new origin by Jeff Johns, all these different things that took place and sort of reshuffling his character, changing him around, updating him for the modern reader. These are the kind of things that happen. And so the result is that in this instance, with regards to the return of Barry Allen, as it's being told by Jay Garrick to Barry's wife at the time, Iris West, what he basically says is that when Barry showed up, their goal was to actually stop the bullet, to catch the bullet that shot Orion. The problem is they couldn't. They could not catch the bullet in time. And the result is that Orion basically died. At the same time, what we also end up finding out is that where Barry Allen was believed to have been dead following the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, what he had actually done is entered the Speed Force. And from the time Crisis on Infinite Earths happened, right up until this moment, he had been quite literally outrunning death. He'd just been running away from death constantly. Again, it was a pretty significant deal. But what things began doing was moving in the direction of basically taking these major characters out of the equation. Batman was basically teleported away by a boom tube. Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern, he was taken away to be put on trial by the Guardians of the Universe for the perceived death of Orion himself and the assault on Jon Stewart. Superman, in a massive explosion that takes place at the Daily Planet, is basically told by some unnamed person they need to leave this universe and they have to go somewhere else in order to save everything. So it's this gradual staged removal of these various characters who exist out there within the DC superheroes landscape. So it's really interesting and it's really kind of wild, because what ends up happening here is we actually end up picking up with this idea of the anti-life equation being quote unquote uploaded to the internet and sent out into the digital space. Because what it it does is it allows Darkseid to basically use the modern era of smartphones and the internet to spread the anti-life equation around the world. So it's really kind of cool because it feeds very much into this idea of technology. Now, in truth, when it came to Grant Morrison as a writer, this was him saying, well, these are the dangers of technology. You know, anybody could conquer the world. Humanity's too dependent on technology. But the overall gist is that the goal of Darkseid proves to be true. He successfully manages to conquer the Earth. The reason why we find this out is because in their efforts to escape death, both Barry Allen and Wally West run several weeks into the future only to find that the world has basically been conquered by Darkseid. Everybody is under the influence of the anti-life equation, and those individuals who try to resist Darkseid never succeed. That in the end, Wonder Woman is one of the superheroes who are under the control of Darkseid. So the question becomes, how did we get from him releasing the anti-life equation to this point in the future, and is there any conceivable way to stop it? But with that being said, guys, I know it's a lot of stuff to throw at you guys. It's a lot of history being tossed towards you guys, but the second part will focus a lot less on that and focus more about the events that are going on in the story itself, because it gets kind of bonkers in terms of all the things that are going on, in terms of all the stuff that's happening. But with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, man, we are here, man. Let me tell you something, Rob Corps, man. Let me tell you something now. And for the crisis, Superboy Prime, man, let me tell you. When Superboy Prime fights everyone, dude, it is. Dude, that's why I titled this Superboy Prime versus everyone, because that's exactly what it is. And he wrecks everyone. It's the coolest thing. It's like the coolest thing ever. I understand. Is this what I've been missing? Is this what I've been missing with DC Comics? Like, let's get into this. All right, because I'm getting hyped up as it is. All right, before we start this, what I want to do is I want to flesh out the multiversal concept in the realm of DC Comics. So here's the deal. All right, those of you guys who are familiar with this, bear with me for a second, but even now it still kind of baffles people a little bit. All right, in the history of DC Comics, there's been two multiverses. I mean, Grant Morrison does his own thing, but we're going to leave Grant Morrison out of this equation. There's been two different iterations of the multiverse. The first one is the one that was destroyed with Crisis on Infinite Earths. The second one is the one that comes back because of this story, Infinite Crisis. So this actually makes a new multiverse, new histories, different things like that. But the fact remains here that we don't need to go into a great big huge explanation about Crisis on Infinite Earths. We know about that story. I've done a video on it. We have the origin of Superboy Prime that kind of helps us to tie into it a little bit. But what ended up happening here is that essentially the multiverse collapsed. So it was the end of all things with regards to the DC universe. And what came after that was one singular universe. So everything that happened in DC Comics between the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985 and right now in the beginning of this story has all taken place in one singular universe called New Earth. That's where that whole phrase comes from. Now, with regards to the characters that we're going to see here, Superboy Prime, Earth 2 Superman, Earth 2 Lois Lane, Earth 3 Alexander Luthor, we don't really have to worry about like Earth 3 and different things like that. All we have to know is that during the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, when the multiverse was collapsing, because of the fact that all these different universes were impacted, the superheroes just ran around grabbing who they could, when they could, and then brought them into the fold to fight against the Anti-Monitor. The result was that because DC wanted to basically revamp the Superman mythos and return Superman to being the sole survivor of Krypton with no other versions of himself out there, what they did is they said, okay, at the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, Superman from Earth 2, which is basically the 1930s, 1940s Superman, Lois Lane from Earth 2 from that same point in time, 1930s, 1940s, and Alexander Luthor, who's basically the son of Lex Luthor from Earth 3, who was a good guy, they're going to be shunted off to the Paradise Dimension. Now, DC's intention with Crisis on Infinite Earths was to never use them again. It was to basically write them out of the story, and the Paradise Dimension was effectively heaven. That's really what it was. It was their own little realm, their own little place. It was heaven, and they were never going to be seen or heard from again. Now, cue the post-crisis landscape. Because of stories like the death of Gwen Stacy in 1971, comic books were moving towards this trend of becoming darker. In the 1980s, I think it was 1986 or 1987, something like that, we ended up getting Batman, The Dark Knight Returns. We got Batman, The Killing Joke. And between those stories, comic books began to become darker and more realistic and more of a reflection of the cynical nature of the real world. Now, with regards to this story, what Geoff Johns is doing is basically issuing a meta commentary. But there are a handful of things that led up to this, because it wasn't like Infinite Crisis just dropped out of nowhere. Like, there were things that were going on that were leading up to this. In JLA, Justice League of America number 118, 119, and 120, what ended up happening is the Justice League was going against various forces that seemed to just kind of be there. They were just, random individuals for the Justice League to fight. But in the middle of all that, Martian Manhunter was just suddenly kidnapped, and the entire Justice League Watchtower was completely obliterated. Now, what we also have is the OMAC project, that story where we talked about Batman's whole OMAC thing and all those different robots and so on and so forth that were just kind of activating throughout the world with the intention of annihilating metahumans. All these things began to converge into the start of Infinite Crisis. Now, there's a handful of other things too, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. We're going to go ahead and jump directly into this. So, of course, this comes as fallout of the destruction of the Justice League Watchtower, but also the revelation from the rest of the Justice League that Batman had created the OMAC project. And because of that, the OMAC project was basically hijacked by Maxwell Lord. Its entire purpose was corrupted, and it became an evil entity. And so the result is that trust in the Justice League is almost completely obliterated. Keep in mind, we also saw Wonder Woman kill Maxwell Lord. And so because of the fact that Maxwell Lord was killed, what this does, or at least what this did, is it resulted in the entire superhero community and the world basically going at odds with one another. Humanity looked at superheroes as dangerous people now. Superheroes, the Justice League, couldn't trust each other. And so because of this, what it does is it switches over to Connor Kent. Now, Connor Kent, as he exists here, there we go, Connell, he's a holdover from the death of Superman. Remember, when Superman died in 1992, 1993, DC released 4 new versions of him. There was the Eradicator, there was Cyborg, there was basically the Metropolis Kid, and then there was John Henry